Vladimir Vladimirovich, we have just observed your meeting on rare earth metals. Excuse me, but I think that right now all journalists around the world are interested in rare earth metals, but in a slightly different context. The United States, to put it very mildly, is strongly urging Zelensky to sign an agreement with them regarding these resources as payment for the aid provided to Ukraine by the previous administration, the Biden administration. How do you assess the prospects of such an agreement?
That does not concern us. I do not assess it in any way and do not even want to think about it. Of course, it would be necessary to evaluate these resources, how real they are, how much of them exist, their value must be, and so on. But, as I repeat, this is not our business. Our concern is what we discussed at the meeting. Rare and rare earth metals are a very important component, very valuable resources for modern industries. We are currently doing little in this area and should be doing more. The purpose of today's meeting was to concentrate administrative resources at the initial stage for work in this direction. By the way, we would be willing to offer cooperation to our American partners as well. When I say partners, I mean not only administrative and government structures, but also companies, if they showed interest in working together. We undoubtedly have an order of magnitude, let me emphasize, an order of magnitude more of such resources than Ukraine. Russia is one of the undisputed leaders in reserves of these rare and rare earth metals. We have them in the north, in Murmansk, in the Caucasus, in Kabardino-Balkaria, in the Far East, in the Irkutsk region, in Yakutia, and in Tuva. These are quite capital-intensive investments, large-scale projects. We would gladly work together with any foreign partners, including Americans. Yes, by the way, regarding the new territories, the same applies. We are ready to attract foreign partners, and in the so-called new historical territories that have returned to the Russian Federation, there are also certain reserves. We are ready to work there as well with our international partners, including American ones.
In the new regions as well?
Yes, of course.
These days, we see a flurry of statements, discussions, and everyone is talking about Trump. Why he is speaking so harshly, insisting that Zelensky must go to elections, and pointing out that his approval rating is at 4%. Europeans are heavily criticizing Trump for these statements, and now we are already hearing opinions that the current approach of the US president is actually playing into Russia's hands. Do you think this is really the case?
I believe that this is absolutely not the case. I have my own opinion on this, which is the opposite of what you have just expressed. The fact is that the current head of the Kiev regime is becoming a toxic figure for Ukraine's armed forces because he issues absurd orders driven not by military considerations, but by political motives whose basis is unclear. And this leads to unjustifiably heavy losses, if not to say catastrophic losses, for the Ukrainian army. He is also becoming toxic for society as a whole. And I think today's vote in the Rada on extending his powers reflects this. Finally, he has cornered himself with a decree banning negotiations with the Russian Federation on a peace agreement and has cut off those negotiations. The issue here is that he is avoiding these negotiations. Why? Because if negotiations begin sooner or later, most likely quite quickly, this would lead to the necessity of lifting martial law. And as soon as that happens, elections must be held immediately. There would be no grounds not to hold elections because today, elections in Ukraine are not being conducted under the pretext of martial law. But if negotiations take place, and then there is a quick necessity to lift martial law, elections must follow right away. And this is the real problem for the current head of the regime, because in reality, it does not matter whether he has 4% or any other number. What matters is something else. According to our data, which is objective, his approval rating is exactly half that of his closest potential political opponent. That opponent is Mr. Zaluzhny, the former commander of Ukraine's armed forces, who has been exiled to London. His approval rating is exactly twice as high. And if we also consider the potential support for this possible candidate from other political figures, including former prime ministers or former presidents, then the current head of the regime has absolutely no chance of winning the elections. His chances are zero, unless, of course, there is blatant rigging. But even that would be too obvious. Thus, he is a factor in the degradation of the army, society, and the state. And the current US President Trump surely understands this and is pushing him toward elections. What he seems to want to do, in my view, is to improve the political situation in Ukraine, consolidate society, and create conditions for the survival of the Ukrainian state. And overall, this is not so much beneficial for Russia. After all, we are in conflict with the current regime as it is beneficial for Ukraine itself. Moreover, the current US president has announced that he wants to achieve peace, as, by the way, do we, and as soon as possible. But the current head of the regime stands in the way of achieving that goal. That, in my opinion, explains the US president's position. And it is not because it aligns with Russia's interests. Rather, it is in the interests of Ukraine as a state, with the goal of preserving Ukrainian statehood. We have no objections to that. Although, of course, we would like for this territory not to be used as a staging ground for attacks against the Russian Federation, not to be used as a hostile platform against us, but rather to eventually become a friendly neighboring state.
Every day we hear a wide range of statements from Trump. You have met with him multiple times, and you recently had a phone conversation with him. Does he act based on emotions?
Of course not. Naturally, the current head of the Kiev regime gives him reasons to display emotions. But from what I just said, a completely different picture emerges. These actions are based not on emotions, but on cold calculation and a rational approach to the current situation. Strangely enough, to be honest, we were actually interested in having him, Zelensky, remain in power and continue dismantling the regime with which we are in armed conflict. But in terms of strengthening Ukrainian statehood, one should act more decisively and in a completely different direction, bringing to power people who enjoy the trust of the Ukrainian people.
In your opinion, do the Europeans even understand the real nature of the current situation around Ukraine?
You should ask them. Judging by their actions, it seems to me that they do not fully understand. But that is not the main point. The main point is that, unlike the new President of the United States, European political leaders are tied to the current regime. They are engaged. They have said and promised too much, and now, excuse my bluntness, it is very difficult, if not practically impossible, for them to backtrack without losing face. And given that they are going through a rather difficult and politically sensitive period, elections, re-elections, parliamentary struggles, and so on, changing their position is practically impossible for them. Unlike them, the current President of the United States, the newly elected President, has free hands. He is not bound by those constraints that prevent forward movement and efforts to resolve the conflict. His personality is also a factor. He acts straightforwardly and without much hesitation. He is in a unique position. He not only says what he thinks, but he says what he wants. Well, that is a privilege of the leader of a major world power.
A few days ago in St. Petersburg, I asked you about how everyone now wants to have a say in Russian-American negotiations, but the Europeans continue to insist and demand a role in negotiations around Ukraine. How do you assess this?
I do not see anything wrong with that. However, no one can demand anything here, especially from Russia. They can demand from someone else. For centuries, they have been making demands of their vassals, and now demands are being made of them. So let them sit at home with their demands and think about how they ended up in this situation. But their participation in the negotiation process is, of course, needed. We have never refused discussions. We have constantly engaged with them. At some point, they themselves cut off contact with us under the illusion that they could defeat Russia on the battlefield. If they want to return, fine. I have seen the reaction to my phone conversation with the US President, as well as the reaction to the high-level meeting in Riyadh. It was indeed emotional and lacked practical meaning. Why? Because in order to address complex and even acute issues, including the Ukrainian track, both Russia and the United States need to take the first step. What does this first step entail? It should focus on increasing the level of trust between the two countries. That is exactly what we were doing in Riyadh, and that is what future high-level contacts may also be dedicated to. Without this, no issue can be resolved, including one as complex and sensitive as the Ukrainian crisis. But what do the Europeans have to do with this? This concerns bilateral Russian-American relations. Why do we need them here? What would they even be doing? In the phone conversation and in the meeting in Riyadh, we did touch on issues related to the Ukrainian crisis, but it was not a substantive discussion. We only agreed that we would approach this issue at some point in that sense, and in that case, of course, we do not exclude European participation. I want to emphasize that we respect the position of our friends in BRICS, who have created a group of peace supporters. Just today, I spoke with the President of the People's Republic of China, and we also discussed this. He informed me that the Friends of Peace group in New York will meet again soon to discuss these matters. We not only welcome this, but we are also grateful to all our partners who are raising these issues and striving for peace. What is my point? Not only Europeans, but also other countries have the right to participate, and we respect that.
I would like to ask you to comment on a few more statements from Trump. There are quite a lot of them, as I mentioned.
But not all of them, okay?
But not all of them. For example, he mentioned that he wants to propose to you and the Chinese leader to cut defense budgets by half. What do you think of this idea?
I am aware of this and can guess what it is based on. It seems to be based on calculations from one of the British research centers, where our expenditures were calculated based on purchasing power parity. Last year, the US had, I believe, about $968 billion in defense spending. And if you combine Russian and Chinese expenditures, the numbers roughly match Russia and China together compared to the US. First, all of this needs to be properly calculated. The British Centre's estimates may be correct, or they may not be entirely accurate, or even completely incorrect. This needs to be reviewed. Second, I cannot comment on how the People's Republic of China would react to this. There have been various approaches from the American side regarding strategic offensive weapons and other serious issues. So that is up to China. But as for us, we could reach an agreement with the United States. We are not opposed. I think the idea is good. If the US cuts by 50%, we will cut by 50%. Then China could join in later if it chooses. We believe this is a good proposal and are open to discussions on this matter.
Trump has also imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from all countries. We once had good cooperation with the US on aluminum. What do you think of this trade policy?
I do not want to comment on US trade policy right now. It has been linked to sanctions for many years. We consider these sanctions illegal and harmful for global trade and the economy. In my view, they damage both us and those who impose them. As for trade policy, higher tariffs and duties, each country determines what is beneficial for itself. I understand the logic: to bring production back home, create jobs, force businesses to pay taxes across all levels of the tax system, and so on. But at some point, these actions will inevitably face difficulties related to inflationary pressures, rising product costs, etc. But economic experts can explain this in detail. Regarding aluminum, in 2017, we supplied about 15% of all aluminum imports to the US. Roughly 15% came from Russia. In general, if I recall correctly, the US produces about 60% of its required aluminum domestically and imports the remaining 40%. Canada is the main supplier today. If a decision were made to reopen the US market to our producers, we could sell approximately 2 million tons of aluminum there. This would not significantly affect price formation, but would, in my opinion, help stabilize prices. More importantly, I believe that we could also consider joint projects with American companies in this sector. For example, in Krasnoyarsk Krai, There were Soviet-era plans to build a new hydroelectric power station and expand aluminum production. After all, aluminum is primarily about energy, preferably cheap energy. Hydropower is affordable and environmentally friendly. Those plans still exist. They are capital-intensive and investment-heavy projects. According to preliminary estimates, the project would cost around $15 billion in today's prices. We can think about this. Yes, the current US president's policy is to relocate production within the US. But if American companies operate in Russia, that is also a significant advantage. Companies would make substantial profits, and stable volumes of aluminum would enter the US market at reasonable prices. This is something worth considering, just like joint work on rare earth metals and other areas, including energy.
By the way, just a few minutes ago, I read a new report from the US. President Trump announced that the US and Russia are discussing major economic projects as part of negotiations on Ukraine.
Yes, some of our companies are in contact with each other and are discussing such projects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.